Hi, guys. It was a long and worrisome day. The afternoon classes went much the same as the morning ones. First, Renee would feel heartened by how well he and Sticky had done on the quiz, then dismayed by the hateful looks their success brought them from the other students and messengers in general, but especially from Martina. And if Kate and Constance were drawing no such unpleasant attention themselves, it was only because they were having a terrible time with the quizzes, which was even more discouraging. When the last class was dismissed, the four of them went out onto the plaza and sat on a stone bench, all but Kate, who bounced in place, burning off energy. Most of the institute students spent the hour before supper playing in the gym or else watching television in their rooms. But the mysterious Benedict Society had wanted a little time to themselves, as it turned out. They spent their whole time on the plaza, undisturbed by Martina or anyone at all. And yet they spoke hardly a word. The reason was they could not stop staring, with a curious mixture of fascination, fear, and uneasiness, at Mr. Curtin in his green plaid suit, silvery glasses, and demonic wheelchair. The plaza was a favorite spot of his. The children had seen him there the day before, too, also at night. It was well known that Mr. Curtin often sat there for an hour or so in the afternoons, during which time no one ever disturbed him but executives. And they came to him only with urgent matters. This afternoon was no different. Everyone who crossed the plaza gave Mr. Curtin a wide berth, and no one ever passed in front of him, as he seemed to delight in gazing off toward the bridge in the distance, and no one wished to disturb his view. Gazing aside, Mr. Curtin was hardly idle. He had a stack of newspapers with him and was going through them meticulously, occasionally marking things and smiling mysteriously. From time to time, he opened a large book, which he carried in his lap, and made notes inside it. Then he would gaze off into the distance again. Eventually, Mr. Curtin spun around and shot across the plaza, disappearing inside the Institute Control Building and snapping the children out of their trance. Having spent so much time staring, and since supper they were unable to get to the table themselves, the children would have to wait until after lights out for any secret discussions. For the evenings were devoid of study time, or devoted to studying time. It was essential that Renee and Sticky continued to do well on their quizzes, especially if Kate and Constance didn't start doing well. And at any rate, one of the few rules of executives seemed willing to admit was that students were not allowed in one another's rooms. Private meetings among regular students were short of a thing strictly followed upon and in the Institute, where all secrets were reserved for messengers and executives. There was no prohibition regarding the dormitory corridors during study time, however, and before the children holed up in their rooms to labor over their notes, they lingered a few minutes outside the door to Renee and Sticky's room. If they didn't talk to each other now, it was only because they were eavesdropping. They had discovered that at this time of day, there was a considerable amount of activity and conversation in the corridor, which always provided an opportunity to learn something. Here and there, along the corridor, little clusters of students stood talking, reluctant to knuckle down and study yet, and a steady stream of children toting toothbrushes and toiletries passed in and out of the bathrooms. This evening, the most obvious eavesdroppers were Renee and Sticky's neighbors, a couple of thick-middled older boys who had made a point of never speaking to Renee and Sticky. The boys stood in their doorway, playing a game that involved kicking each other in the shins without crying. And as they kicked and grimaced back and forth, they speculated endlessly about the messenger's secret privileges. This was a favorite conversation among non-messengers, but never a productive one, as it was no different with these boys. It soon became clear that neither had any idea what the privileges were, that they were much to be coveted. The boys talked quickly, wore thin, and Renee just was about to give up and go study when Jackson's voice boomed down the corridor. "Corliss Denton, there you are." A few doors down, Corliss Denton jumped. Everyone jumped, but Corliss jumped the highest. He turned to look with strangely guilty eyes at Jackson, who came marching toward him through the little cluster of students, all of whom flattened themselves against the walls to let him pass. Just moments ago, all gossip and hubbub fell silence as a graveyard. Corliss straightened his messenger sash as Jackson came up. What? What's the matter, Jackson? You know what the matter is, Corliss, said Jackson. Mr. Curtin needs to speak with you. I have come to show you to the waiting room. At the mention of the waiting room, Corliss, who was fair-skinned to begin with, turned positively white. The boys from the neighboring room flinched and took a quick step backward, trying to disassociate themselves. A murmur spread down the corridor. But Mr. Corliss cleared his throat. He tugged at the bottom of his tunic. But, come on, Jackson. Why would I be punished? What? You aren't being punished. Mr. Curtin only wants to speak with you. But he's busy at the moment, so you'll have to wait. Come with me now. Corliss shook his head and stepped back. You know what? I don't think so. I think I'll just... He glanced left and right, contemplating the corridor exits. Jackson's tone was casual but firm. I understand that you don't like to wait, Corliss. Nobody likes waiting. But if you don't want to go to the waiting room and lose your special privileges, then you better come right now. Corliss cringed. No, that won't be necessary. I'll go with you, Jackson. I suppose one way or another I'm going to have to wait. Is that right? One way or another. Corliss took a deep breath to steady himself. Okay, you bet. Whatever Mr. Curtin wants. You'll get no complaints from me. Jackson winked. That a boy. Let's get moving. He put his hand on Corliss's shoulder and walked him out the far exit. The moment Corliss had gone, the corridor erupted into a cacophony of excited conversation. One girl even burst into tears. She'd once been in the waiting room herself, apparently, and was distraught at the mere mention of the place. As the girl's friends tried to console her, Renee and Sticky's thick-headed neighbors were still staring at the exit through which Jackson had led Corliss as if to his doom. The waiting room, one boy said. I don't know messengers ever got sent to the waiting room. Let's not talk about it, said the other, shaking his head. I think it's bad luck to talk about it. I don't think I need that kind of luck. The boys went to the room and closed the door behind them. Renee and the others looked anxiously at one another. I think perhaps we ought to avoid being sent to the waiting room, said Constance. You think? Said Kate. Sticky took out his polishing cloth. All right, that's the end of the chapter. Like and subscribe. Click that bell for future notifications. Share.